Well, good evening, everyone. It's a joy to be with you. Lovely to see you all. As we move from chapter 6 of Daniel's prophecy, which we considered this morning, to chapter 7, a significant change takes place. The early chapters, that's from chapter 1 to chapter 6, are all taken up with narrative. That is to say, they tell stories. They tell us things that happened in the life of Daniel, and they're, for that reason, easy to understand. But the latter half of the book, from chapter 7 onwards, consists of a series of powerful visions, colourful visions, and we had the first of them read to us just now. They're written in a graphic style, almost a bizarre style. And those who enjoy reading works of fantasy will feel that they're entering familiar territory here. This style of writing has a name. It's called apocalyptic. It was a product, by the way, of persecution. It's almost a kind of code, so that God's people who are passing through a period of persecution can understand the code and its various symbols, and the enemies of God's people can't understand what's being said here. This style of writing arose toward the end of the Old Testament era, when the Jewish people were dwarfed by powerful neighbours, when they were surrounded by the great powers of the day, such as the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, and others too. And then, of course, it carried over into the early Christian era, when the church was up against colossal forces that threatened to crush it. Now, as a style, it's somewhat grotesque. That deserves to be said. In apocalyptic books, you meet huge natural forces, strange events in the weather. You also meet hybrid monsters, animals that are not like normal animals. You might meet something with the body of a lion and the head of a bull. You might meet other creatures that are far from the sort of things that you would meet in the natural world. You also meet a fascination for numbers that occur again and again. Several types of apocalyptic literature were produced in the era between the Testaments, and some were included in the canon of Scripture. In the Old Testament, as well as the book of Daniel, there are portions in Isaiah, Joel, Zechariah, and Ezekiel. The New Testament contains an outstanding example, the revelation that was given to John. Now, the word apocalyptic gives us a clue as to how we should understand this type of book. It actually means unveiling. It's what happens when you pull aside a pair of curtains and the light floods in, because you have done. A curtain is pulled aside and we're privileged to see something that will help us understand rather better what's going on. Now, think of the Battle of Britain. Think of that war in the air that was going on when Hitler sent his air force to try to destroy the Royal Air Force so that he could then mount his invasion of the United Kingdom. Think in particular of the airdrome at Biggin Hill in Kent. Think of the airdrome at Duxford in Cambridgeshire. Now, underground is the operations room at both of those locations. The Air Vice Marshal is sitting in a high chair, rather like this one, but it's even higher. He's looking on a huge map of the Channel approaches and the south of England and the north coast of France. And at his bidding, young female members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, known as WAAFs, because of that abbreviation, they're moving models of aircraft, German aircraft, British aircraft, across this enormous plotting table that's marked out like a map. It's all strangely reassuring because the atmosphere is calm and steady. Anyone who was outside and who was watching what was taking place in the real world would feel completely baffled, because above them in the sky you could see wheeling aircraft and chaos. But a cool brain is at work behind the scenes. The Air Vice Marshal is in control, and he knows what he wants to happen. Now, it may all appear to be frantic if you stepped outside the doors of the control room and watched the young men who were hurling their aircraft about, trying to destroy the enemy. But in the same way, these visions in Daniel will tell us that the events that unfold in our world are actually the outworking of great spiritual forces behind the scenes. And that's what it's all about. So let's now begin to look at what we've got before us here. The first heading will take a lot longer than the subsequent one. The four kingdoms. And we're going to look, first of all, at verses 1 to 8, and then at the way that it's explained subsequently in verses 15 to 26. So have you got that? First of all, verses 1 to 8, and then verses 15 to 16, verses 15 to 26, where the vision is explained. So as our chapter opens, the time frame moves backward. It moves from the reign of Cyrus to the reign of Belshazzar. It's a flashback. Belshazzar was the deputy monarch of Babylon, and these were difficult years for Daniel. He had been prominent and influential during the reign of mighty Nebuchadnezzar, the king who had a brief period of madness, but now Daniel had been sidelined when the new regime came to power. And when the final crisis came, and Belshazzar quite literally saw the writing on the wall, well, Daniel, by that stage, had become a forgotten man of Babylonian politics. And verses 1 to 8 of our chapter give us Daniel's account of a vision that he himself had received. Not that one of the kings received, but that he himself received. And then later in the chapter, from verse 15 onwards, the vision is explained. Now, it must have been an enormous privilege to receive a vision from God. For God to communicate directly with a human being. But we're told that there was a price to be paid for that. There's a mental cost, an emotional cost, and some modern Christians, I don't know if you've met them, but I have, who speak so glibly about getting a picture from God. Yet they seem to show so little of the profound psychological disturbance that Daniel went through when this vision came to him. Well, the vision begins out at sea. The Great Sea is mentioned. Now that obviously was the Mediterranean, because Jewish people drew a contrast between the Dead Sea, which was a large inland lake of salt water, and the Mediterranean, which was further, from their point of view, to the west. The Hebrews, by the way, were not a seafaring people for the most part, and they mistrusted the ocean. They rather feared it. Even though it was part of God's creation, they were not natural seafarers as British people have been for most of their history. Those who went down to the sea in ships obviously were privileged to see the works of the Lord, but it seemed to Jewish people by and large to be a rather alien kind of environment and rather hostile. Who could tell what was down there? Who could tell what lurked beneath the surface? Even when its surface was placid, let me put it this way, it was like the smile on the face of a villain. Isaiah the prophet says this, "The wicked are like the troubled sea, when it cannot rest, whose waters cast up mire and dirt." You never knew what might lurk down there. You know, strange things sometimes land on the beach. Things like octopus and squid. Things with all those tentacles and suckers on them and strange numbers of eyes. It would be entirely appropriate to the Hebrew mind to expect something hideous to come up from down below. And as Daniel saw in his vision, the wind blew from each of the 4 points of the compass, and 4 monsters appeared in succession, one after the other. Now, the explanation that we get later in the chapter, in verse 17, makes it clear that these ghastly creatures represented 4 kingdoms that were going to arise in succession in Daniel's part of the world, one after the other. Now, at this point, we have to resist the temptation to try to assume that those kingdoms can be identified with modern countries that exist in the world today. Countries which use animals to represent their identity. The British lion, the American eagle, the Russian bear, and so on. So don't feel any kind of temptation to think that Daniel is talking about countries that exist in today's world. He's not. Countries in today's world didn't exist at the time that Daniel received this vision. It's usually a sound policy when we're reading the apocalyptic books to concentrate on the general impression that we get rather than getting too hung up about the detail that's there. Too much attention to detail can be counterproductive. Perhaps the most helpful way to assess this particular vision is to compare it with something earlier in Daniel's prophecy, chapter 2, the vision that was given to King Nebuchadnezzar of a large statue, a large image that was a composite image 4 different layers in the statue, and that was eventually destroyed by a stone that wasn't made by human hands and that seemed to come out of nowhere and eventually hit the statue and toppled it. Now, the vision of the big statue, destroyed by this strange stone that came from nowhere at all, well, that was given to a pagan king. And now this other vision, the vision of the 4 hideous beasts that came one after the other, that was given to a godly prophet. But they've got some similarities. So as we unfold the story, I'll make mention of both of them together. I want to say, though, even at this early stage, that Daniel was given a sobering glimpse of the powers and forces that would shape the near future from his perspective. All right so far? Now, in the first place, verse 4, the lion with eagle's wings was like the head of the great image, chapter 2, verse 38. And it stands for King Nebuchadnezzar and the empire that succeeded him, the Babylonian Empire. Now, the way that this beast was given a man's heart, did you see that? It's reminiscent of the way that Nebuchadnezzar himself became mad for a time and then was restored to sanity by the kindness of God in his dealings with him. It's a remarkable story, and it's mentioned earlier in Daniel's prophecy. And then in second place, we've got a ravenous bear with 3 ribs in its mouth. Verse 5. Well, that's like the breast and the arms of the colossal image, and it's a symbol, I'd like to suggest, of the Persian Empire, which was the next power to arise in that region of the world. By the way, the Persian Empire subdued 3 empires, each in their turn: Lydia and Babylon and Egypt. Thirdly, the next monster to come along, the swift leopard with 4 heads, verse 6, was like the great statue's belly and thighs of bronze, chapter 2, verse 32. And that is essentially a representative of what happened after the meteoric rise of Alexander the Great. Having conquered the Persian Empire in his early 30s, one of the most remarkable military stories of the ancient world, he then died in no time at all. And suddenly, the vast empire he had amassed was divided between 4 of his generals. Did you notice that our passage mentions that this empire broke into 4 parts? And finally, the 4th beast that follows, the 4th monster, verse 7, didn't resemble any known animal around at the time. It was a terrible spectacle. Its grim iron teeth, its habit of trampling on all its path, it could strike terror into the stoutest heart. Well, I would suggest that's the Roman Empire that comes along next. Like the great statues, legs and feet, also partly of iron, it stands for the awesome might of the Roman war machine. a British chieftain who was suppressed by Rome when it came to our island, a man named Caractacus, once had the courage to say to a Roman general who had subdued him, "You Romans make a desert and call it peace." This fourth beast also had 10 horns, which gave way in their turn to a single little horn. Now, I'll just pause for a moment. I want to say something about horns. Throughout the Old Testament, the horn is a symbol of power. Horns gore, and horns thrust, horns erupt and penetrate. Now, at this point, we do well to be tentative in our conclusions. Godly commentators have produced numerous different suggestions as to what the 10 horns might be, and therefore what the symbolism of the fourth beast might mean and how it should be understood. The 10 horns, do they emerge all at the same time? Or do they occur one after the other? Is the number 10 to be understood literally, or should it be understood as a kind of round number indicating completion? Well, the suggestion that I would offer here is that the symbol of the fourth beast, the Roman Empire, hints at 3 stages that follow on. There's the beast itself, which I've suggested is the Roman Empire. Then there's the emergence of the 10 horns that follow on. And finally, after that, the appearance of the little horn. Now, some confusion's possible about the little horn too, because another little horn is mentioned in chapter 8 of Daniel's prophecy. These 2 little horns, they don't describe the same entity or the same person. The little horn in chapter 7 arises out of the situation left by the emergence of this fourth beast, who I've suggested to you is the Roman Empire. And there's a marked similarity between the 2 little horns, chapter 7, chapter 8. They share similar traits of character, but nevertheless, the one mentioned in chapter 8 belongs in the past. And that's important. His time has already come and gone. It's possible to identify him with some precision. And if I were to come again at some point, I could tell you all about him. But the little horn in our present chapter, however, although he shares the attitudes of the one in chapter 8, has yet to make his appearance. He hasn't showed up yet. Now, at this point, I'd like to attempt a tentative reconstruction of the central thrust of Daniel's vision. The 4 beasts represent 4 regional superpowers that would dominate the ancient world of the Middle East in turn. Babylon, Persia, the Empire of Alexander, and the 4 Greek-speaking successor states that followed Alexander. And then the Roman Empire, which in its turn would give way to a multiplicity of powers represented by the 10 horns. Think of when the Roman Empire broke up, and you get numerous states that arose after it. France, Spain, Germany, and so on. Now, it's a mistake, I think, to take the figure 10 too literally, as it's simply impossible to identify these powers that arose after Rome fell with too much precision. The Roman Empire fell in the West in the year 476 AD. It didn't fall in Eastern Europe until 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Turks. But even after all this time, it's amazing that Rome holds such a hold on the imagination of even modern people. Since that time, a whole cluster of nation-states has arisen out of the territory that Rome once held. Now, finally, we see the emergence of this person described as the little horn. You see the way he's intended to represent a single person. He speaks pompous words. What does that mean? He's the persecutor of God's people, verse 25. Who is this person? This great blasphemer, this monster of wickedness. He will, for a defined but limited period, terrorize the people of God. Well, he's described for us in the New Testament. He's described in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3 to verse 8. The Apostle Paul describes him in this way: "Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition." That, by the way, means the son of lostness. This person is the quintessential essence of what it means to be lost. This person who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing that he is God, claiming to be the one and true and living God. Do you not remember that when I was still with you, Paul says, I told you these things? And now you know what is restraining, that he may be revealed in his own time. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he's taken out of the way. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. I want to put this to you. The little horn marks the culmination of a long process. In every era of history, powers and rulers have risen in the world who seem in their own time to be the living embodiment of evil. They defy God to the point where they become the living and breathing essence of blasphemy. States and powers and the people who rule them often set out to crush the life out of Christian communities. Antiochus Epiphanes, 2 or 3 centuries before the time of the Lord Jesus Christ, the Emperor Nero, the Emperor Diocletian, Queen Mary Tudor, King Philip II of Spain, Stalin in his day, Kim Jong-un in North Korea, and many more. The list is almost endless. They've come and gone in almost every century. The list of them is almost endless, and lesser versions of them today, even now, still trample on the godly and tear at them with teeth of iron. And when the story of this world has almost run its course, one more such monster will arise. Satan's last throw, the last and most hideous of them, the quintessence of blasphemy, the man who will demand the loyalty of the whole populated globe, and who will claim, listen, who will claim to be none other than the returning Christ himself. When that day comes, the whole world will be as North Korea is now. It's not that there will be no Christians at that time. Christians will still be there, but organized Christianity and living local churches will almost have disappeared from the scene. I'll turn the page if it will let me. Now, Daniel stood firm in his day. Here's the question, are we standing firm in ours? One day a generation of Christians will be called to stand firm against the wiles and the tyrannies of the Antichrist. Now, you may disagree with me about the identity of these four beasts, but this vision was not given for us to spark an evangelical parlor game. You get 15 points for each beast you can identify correctly. The vision was given to sober us up, to help us realize that Christianity is not a game, to remind us that we live in a world where the nations have formed an armed conspiracy against the Lord and his Christ, as Psalm 2 tells us, where the people plot against the Lord and his anointed. And whether you conclude, as some might do, that this particular preacher is a heretic, whatever else you take away from this message, get this straight. Christianity is emphatically not a game. Principalities and powers are on the march against the little flock of Jesus Christ. Now that brings me to my second heading. I've only got two, and this is going to be shorter. The fifth kingdom. Try to picture Daniel's state of mind halfway through the vision. He's seen a fourfold hurricane rip away the upper layers of the ocean to reveal the horror beneath the depths. Four grotesque monsters have come and gone, the last of them an essay in brute force and relentless efficiency. He's seen a number of other kingdoms come and go, the 10 horns that followed on from the fourth beast. And at last they've been replaced by a towering ego, the most relentless blasphemer and persecutor that the world will ever see. Now, do you suppose by this time that the aged prophet was reeling as horror was piled upon horror? And then suddenly in verse 9, the curtain is pulled aside, and all that Daniel has seen thus far is true, but it's not the whole picture. Now we see a glimpse of another world, and we breathe clean air. Chaos is replaced by the high command of an imperial court. We're privileged to look through Daniel's eyes at the throne room of the universe. All is calm, all is serene, God Most High, clothed in the dignity of endless years, radiant with purity, sits enthroned high above his angelic attendants, 10,000 upon 10,000. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Verse 10. Now immediately this offers reassurance. The evil that rampages up and down this world has not gone unnoticed. All the while, the Almighty has been taking note. Every single godless tyrant, from Nimrod in the ancient world to Kim Jong-un today, convinced himself for a time that he was getting away with it. While all along, the great judge of all the earth has been keeping accounts, waiting for the reckoning. And there will be a reckoning. The beast, who seemed so big, that fourth one, with the iron claws and teeth. Well, that beast is to be obliterated, verse 11. And in the end, the destruction of Antichrist himself will be emphatic. He's not an opponent worthy of God's mettle. It will not require a long and protracted struggle to finish him off. The breath of God's mouth will be sufficient. The brightness of Christ's coming will unmake him. The spiritual forces that have dismayed and frustrated believers for century upon century, and which seem so implacable and so huge, they'll disappear like a wisp of smoke. Gone. The sheer ease with which the Almighty will dispatch his enemies will amaze his wandering people. Why were we so frightened of them? And Daniel also foresaw the complete vindication of God's people. Verse 22, verse 27. It's all tied in with the remarkable portion of the vision recorded in verses 13 and 14. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. The various beasts, they will be destroyed, even the ones that seem to flatten everything around them in their rage. The four superpowers of the ancient world have come and they've gone, and others since that time have had their little day. But there's another king and another kingdom. It belongs to the one like the Son of Man. The throne of the universe is now occupied by one who's godlike and human, and all his people will share his destiny. Then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom's an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. What do we see in Daniel 5:17, going back to the time when Nebuchadnezzar had his period of madness and then was restored? Well, we see an aged prophet confronting a heathen king, entirely unmoved by extravagant promises of fabulous wealth, just as he was later undaunted by the threat of a pride of lions. Daniel looked the king in the eye. I'm sure that this is partly because he'd seen the vision that's recorded for us here in chapter 7. He knew himself to be a citizen of the fifth monarchy, the monarchy of the man who is God, the monarchy of the perfect man who is himself the everlasting God, the kingdom that would outlast all the others. He'd seen a vision of hideous monsters representing the political religious forces that would shape world history in the ancient world and for a long time after. But high above all the turmoil, he'd also seen the king in all his beauty. He'd been granted a sight of the triumph that awaits Messiah and his people. Now this is a critical chapter for the church on the brink of evil days. Don't worry about the small print. Don't worry about which the third rib in the bear's mouth might be. What were the three horns displaced by the little horn? What exactly is meant by the phrase time, times, and half a time? I haven't a clue. What does this chapter tell us? Well, to sum up, it tells us that the Church of Jesus Christ is a despised minority. It always has been, it always will be. It tells us that colossal spiritual forces are raised against us, that this was always the case and it always will be. Believers, like Daniel, must brace themselves to fight against the odds. Look around you, and the odds are impossible. We're dwarfed by the assembled hosts of darkness. Well, in that case, don't look around. Look up. Look up to the place where thrones are assembled and the Ancient of Days is seated. Look up to the Son of Man in his splendor. Look at him, and Satan shrinks to the size of a mere pygmy, because then things return to their proper proportions. And even the little horn is not as big as he seemed. And some little Belshazzar may be waiting for you at work, in the office, on Monday or Tuesday. Subjects of the fifth monarch, I bid you gaze upon the majesty of your own king, because compared with him, all other kings are the merest pygmies. I'll leave you with that.